The darkness here is absolute. Not the kind of darkness one finds in a closed room or beneath a heavy quilt, but the kind that presses against the skin, that feels alive with secrets. The perpetual night of the Alaskan winter greeted me the moment I stepped off the snow-slicked plain, the cold like a sharp reprimand against my cheeks. I hadn't been back to Greystead in nearly 5 years. The village, cradled in a hollow of endless frost, seemed smaller now than I remembered, its buildings hunched against the cold like weary travelers. The air carried the faint metallic tang of snow, and the sight of the frost-coated rooftops stirred a quiet ache of nostalgia, though I wouldn't call it fondness. My sister, Abigail, was waiting near the lone vehicle parked by the airstrip, her figure bundled in layers that rendered her almost shapeless. Her wave was subdued, her gloved hand moving with a sluggishness that mirrored the sleepy rhythm of this place. "Hannah," she called, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her mouth. "I thought you'd never make it." I forced a smile as I approached, dragging my single suitcase behind me. Delayed in Anchorage. The storm. I gestured to the thick, swirling clouds that loomed in the distance, threatening a blizzard. Abigail didn't respond immediately. She merely nodded and opened the car door. As we drove through the narrow, snow-packed roads toward our childhood home, her silence filled the space between us. She'd never been one for small talk, but tonight it felt heavier, as though something unsaid lingered just beyond her lips. The village itself was unchanged, as though frozen in time along with the landscape. The same general store stood at the corner of Main Street, its peeling sign barely visible under the string of Christmas lights that clung weakly to its awning. The church bell tower loomed above the rest, its silhouette stark against the indigo sky. "You'll stay for a few days?" Abigail asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Through Christmas," I replied, watching the headlights carve through the darkness ahead. "I have to be back in Anchorage by New Year's." She didn't press me. Instead, she gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles pale against the leather gloves. I had the impression she wanted to say something, perhaps about the village, or the strange unease that clung to the air, but thought better of it. It wasn't until we reached the house that I noticed the absence of noise. No children laughing, no muffled chatter from families indoors. Even the wind seemed restrained, as though afraid to disturb the stillness. Our house was a modest structure, its once bright paint dulled by years of harsh winters. Abigail carried my bag inside without a word, and I followed, my boots leaving wet imprints on the wooden floorboards. The warmth of the interior was a welcome contrast to the bitter cold, but it didn't erase the feeling that something was amiss. Abigail busied herself in the kitchen, setting the kettle on the stove and arranging a plate of biscuits on the counter. "You'll be comfortable in your old room," she said, not meeting my eyes. I nodded, though comfort was not the word I would have chosen. That room, with its narrow bed and window that overlooked the forest, had always felt like a cell. As I unpacked my belongings, I glanced out that same window. The treetops were shrouded in frost, their branches brittle and unmoving. Beyond them lay the research station, though its lights were faint and distant, barely piercing the gloom. Something about the view unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the memory of childhood stories, the whispered warnings about staying too long in the woods, about the things that stirred beneath the snow. When Abigail called me for tea, I left the window and joined her in the small living room. The silence of the house felt oppressive now, and though we made polite conversation about the weather and the state of the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't telling me. Later that night, as I lay in bed beneath layers of heavy quilts, I heard it for the first time, a faint, rhythmic sound, like a soft crunching of snow. It came from the direction of the forest, steady and deliberate. I told myself it was the wind shifting the trees, or perhaps a stray animal foraging for food. But as I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, I couldn't escape the sensation that the sound wasn't random. It was too measured, too precise. And it was coming closer. As I stood at the window of my childhood home, Staring out into the unbroken white wilderness of our Alaskan village, a strange disquiet settled over me. The kind of disquiet that creeps in unnoticed, threading its way through the quiet moments of snowfall and the low hum of a distant wind. Alex had been gone longer than expected, his rebellious nature making him prone to wandering, but this wasn't like him. The snowstorm was building, its icy tendrils scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers, and he had promised to return before dusk. The village itself was eerily still, blanketed in a hushed quiet that felt more oppressive than peaceful. Jack, sitting by the fire with his old pipe and stories of Arctic expeditions, had paused mid-sentence, his sharp eyes narrowing as he listened to the silence. It wasn't just the absence of Alex that unsettled him, I could tell. Something else was gnawing at him, some primal instinct awakened by the unnatural stillness. "It's not the boy I'm worried about," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I left the house despite his protests. The bitter cold bit through my coat as I trudged through the snow toward the village center. It felt wrong, everything felt wrong. The snow wasn't just falling, it was swirling in strange patterns, almost as though it were being drawn toward something. The air itself shimmered faintly, like frost catching the edges of unseen light. The first sign of something amiss was at the edge of the square. A streak of iridescent green stretched across the snow, glistening like spilled antifreeze. My medical instincts kicked in. I knelt to inspect it, my breath catching in my throat as I realized it wasn't a liquid at all. It was some kind of crystalline growth, delicate and sharp, and it seemed to pulse faintly as though alive. I was startled by the sound of something crunching behind me, and I whirled around to see Alex stumbling through the snow, his face pale and drawn. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his eyes were wide with something I couldn't name, fear, maybe, or something worse. "Alex!" I called, running to him. But as I approached, I saw it, the same iridescent crystals creeping along the edges of his jacket, spreading up his arms. His breath came in shallow gasps, each exhale clouding the air in unnatural shapes. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. His words were fractured, his voice trembling. I pulled him inside the small community center, which was mercifully close by. Jack had followed, his weathered face set in grim determination. I laid Alex down on one of the tables, stripping his coat away to examine him. The crystals were spreading, their growth slow but deliberate, embedding themselves in his skin like frostbite gone horribly awry. "What happened?" I asked sharply, my voice firm despite the panic clawing at my chest. In the caves," his words were almost incoherent. "It's alive." Jack's expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in the man who had once faced Arctic wolves without flinching. "The expedition," he muttered, pacing the small room. "They brought something back." I didn't have time to ask more, because the lights flickered, once, twice, and then plunged us into darkness. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it a sound I'll never forget, a high-pitched, keening wail that echoed through the village. Jack moved to the door, his rifle in hand, and gestured for me to stay put. "Lock this door behind me," he ordered. "Don't open it for anything or anyone unless it's me." "Jack, wait." I protested, but he was already gone, swallowed by the storm. I turned back to Alex, whose condition was worsening by the second. The crystals had reached his neck now, shimmering faintly in the dim light. His breathing was labored, and his skin felt like ice beneath my fingers. I had to do something. But what? The village clinic was small and ill-equipped, and I was battling something I couldn't even begin to understand. As I searched desperately through the medical supplies, I realized that the faint shimmering wasn't just coming from Alex, it was in the air around us. The realization hit me like a blow, the infection wasn't just spreading through contact. It was in the very atmosphere, carried by the storm. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the faint sound of footsteps reached my ears, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to Jack. Something, or someone, was outside. The footsteps outside grew louder, crunching against the snow with a weight that sent a chill racing down my spine. They didn't match Jack's hurried stride or the tentative, unsteady steps of a villager braving the storm. No, these were deliberate, calculated, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where it was going. The small community center suddenly felt oppressively silent, save for Alex's labored breathing and the faint hum of the storm outside. My fingers trembled as I grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, its weight cold and unfamiliar in my hand. I edged toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to flee, though there was nowhere to go. Then came the knock. Not frantic or pleading, but slow and deliberate. 3 knocks, each one reverberating through the wooden door like the toll of a church bell. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely audible above the pounding of my heart. Silence. Only the howling wind responded, carrying faint whispers that sounded almost human, but not quite. Alex stirred on the table behind me, his voice hoarse and strained. "Don't open it." His eyes fluttered open, wide with terror. The crystals on his neck pulsed faintly, as if reacting to the sound outside. The door rattled, as though something on the other side was testing it, pressing against the wood with an unnatural strength. I stepped back, the poker raised, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Stay away," I shouted, though my voice betrayed my fear. And then, the voice came. Low, guttural, and impossibly cold. It was neither male nor female, but something inhuman, a sound that didn't belong in this world. "Let me in," it said, the words dragged out like a slithering serpent. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, the noise echoing through the room. The thing outside laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that froze the blood in my veins. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moments of darkness, I saw something through the frost-covered window. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, its face obscured by a thick hood. But beneath the hood, 2 pinpricks of green light glowed faintly, staring straight at me. "Let me in," the voice repeated, softer this time, almost coaxing. "No." I screamed, the sound raw and desperate. Alex convulsed violently on the table, his body arching as the crystals spread further, their glow intensifying. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and for a moment, I thought he was gone. But then his head snapped toward me, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light. "They're coming," he gasped. "It's not just one, it's..." His words dissolved into a choking sound, and then his body went limp. I barely had time to process his warning before the door buckled, the wood splintering as though struck by an unseen force. The iron poker felt laughably inadequate in my grip, but I held it tightly, bracing myself for whatever was about to come through. The storm outside grew louder, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. And then, the door gave way. But it wasn't the figure I'd seen in the window that stepped inside. No, this was something far worse. A wave of icy air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The figure that emerged was humanoid only in silhouette. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a mass of shifting shadows, with no discernible features except for the same glowing green light that had pierced the window. I swung the poker wildly, the blow connecting with a sickening crunch. The thing staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its head toward me, the green light flaring brighter. "Run," Alex's voice rasped, barely audible. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted through the side door, the storm swallowing me whole as I stumbled into the snow. Behind me, I could hear the thing moving, its steps uneven but fast, closing the distance between us. The wind lashed at my face, blinding me with icy shards, but I kept running, the village lights growing fainter with each step. And then I saw it, the church, its steeple barely visible through the swirling snow. The bell was ringing, though no one had rung it in years. Drawn by some desperate hope, I ran toward it, the sound of the bell growing louder, more distorted, as though it were coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Inside, the church was empty, its pews coated in a fine layer of frost. The stained glass windows cast eerie patterns on the walls, their vibrant colors dulled by the storm outside. I slammed the door shut behind me, barring it with an old wooden beam. The sound of footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, save for my ragged breathing and the distant toll of the bell. But then I heard it again, the voice, closer now, echoing through the church like a whispered prayer. "You can't hide forever." And as the snow began to fall heavier, I realized that the green light wasn't just outside. It was here, flickering faintly beneath the frost-covered floorboards. The light beneath the floor flickered faintly, then surged, casting ghostly green patterns on the frost-laden walls. I froze, my breath misting in the bitterly cold air, as the faint whispers began again, weaving through the stillness like a twisted hymn. The church, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. The oppressive weight of silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the creak of the ancient wooden beams and the distant toll of the bell. I gripped the iron poker tightly, its freezing surface biting into my palm, and edged further into the nave. The whispering grew louder, taking on the cadence of voices, dozens of them. They rose and fell in disjointed phrases, a chaotic symphony of words I couldn't fully understand. But one thing was clear, they were calling my name. Elliot. The sound was close now, no longer distant but coming from beneath the very floorboards I stood on. The frost on the wooden planks began to crackle and melt, as if something below was radiating an unnatural heat. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose board. And then it came. The first hand broke through the floor, long, skeletal fingers covered in a sickly, translucent skin. It clawed at the air, followed by another, and then another, until the floor seemed alive with writhing limbs. "No, no," I muttered, backing away, my chest tightening with panic. The whispers crescendoed, the words now clear. "Let us in, let us in." I turned and bolted toward the altar, the poker still clutched in my hand. Behind me, the floorboards groaned and split as the figures began to rise. Their shapes were humanoid but twisted, their limbs too long and their movements unnaturally fluid. Green light poured from the hollow sockets of their faces, and their mouths hung open in soundless screams. I scrambled up the steps to the altar, searching for anything I could use to barricade myself. My eyes fell on the crucifix mounted on the wall, a heavy, ornate thing made of iron. Without thinking, I yanked it down, the weight of it nearly toppling me over. The figures were advancing now, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The whispers had turned to a low, droning chant, the words ancient and guttural, vibrating through my bones. "Stay back," I shouted, swinging the crucifix wildly. The nearest figure hesitated, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying me. But then it lunged, its arms outstretched, fingers grasping. I swung the crucifix with all my strength, the impact sending the creature sprawling. The others didn't stop. They moved with horrifying speed, climbing over the pews and each other in their frenzy to reach me. The green light beneath the floorboards intensified, spreading like fire through the cracks. It climbed the walls, consuming the stained glass windows in a sickly glow, until the entire church was bathed in an unholy radiance. And then, the bell tolled again. This time, it was deafening, a sound so loud and visceral that it drove me to my knees. The creatures stopped, their heads snapping toward the sound in unison. For a brief moment, they were still, their glowing eyes fixed on the bell tower above. I seized the opportunity and ran, vaulting over the altar and sprinting down the side aisle. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but I didn't stop. The back door loomed ahead, half covered in frost. I threw myself against it, the wood splintering under my weight. The icy night air hit me like a wall, but I kept running, not daring to look back. The village was eerily silent, the snow falling in thick, suffocating sheets. The houses were dark, their windows lifeless, as if the storm had swallowed everyone whole. My boots crunched against the snow, each step feeling heavier than the last. And then I heard it, the bell tolling again, slower this time. With each chime, the whispers returned, carried on the wind, closer now. Elliot. I stumbled into the square, my chest heaving, my vision blurring. The towering Christmas tree stood at the center, its lights flickering weakly, the ornaments swaying as if caught in an unseen breeze. The whispers were all around me now, a cacophony of voices overlapping and merging until they became one. Let us in. The green light appeared again, not from the church this time, but from the tree. It seeped out from beneath the snow, spiraling upward, consuming the decorations in its glow. And then, I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They moved slowly, deliberately, encircling me as the light from the tree grew brighter. I raised the iron poker, though I knew it was useless. The whispers filled my head, drowning out my thoughts, until there was nothing left but their command. Let us in. And as the snow fell heavier, muffling the world in silence, I realized with a cold, sinking dread that there was nowhere left to run. The whispers closed in, a suffocating fog of sound that tangled around my thoughts and made it impossible to think. I staggered backward, away from the glowing tree, as the figures in the shadows emerged fully into the light. Their faces, or what was left of them, were gaunt, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been and mouths twisted into grotesque shapes, as though they were screaming silently. The air itself felt charged, the icy wind cutting through me like knives. The iron poker in my hand was heavy, useless, but I clung to it like a lifeline. The ground beneath my feet began to shift, the snow melting in strange, spiraling patterns that radiated outward from the base of the tree. I turned, desperate for an escape, but the figures were everywhere. They moved with the eerie grace of marionettes, their limbs jerking unnaturally with each step. The green light from the tree pulsed in time with the tolling of the bell, now distant but unrelenting. Let us in, the voices hissed, their tone like nails scraping across glass. I ran toward the nearest house, my boots slipping on the slush-covered cobblestones. The door was locked, the windows dark and unyielding. I pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but there was no answer. The entire village seemed to have vanished, leaving me alone with the nightmare closing in. The light from the tree grew brighter, casting long, spindly shadows across the square. I turned just in time to see one of the creatures lunge toward me. Its skeletal fingers stretched wide, reaching for my throat. With a guttural yell, I swung the poker, the iron connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature crumpled, its body collapsing into a pile of ash and frost, but another took its place immediately, its glowing eyes burning with unrelenting hunger. I ran again, this time toward the bell tower. If I could reach it, if I could stop the bell, maybe, just maybe, I could end this. The wooden door to the tower was ajar, swaying gently in the wind. I burst through it, slamming it shut behind me and jamming the iron poker through the handle as a makeshift lock. The stairs spiraled upward, each step creaking ominously under my weight. Above me, the bell continued to toll, each chime reverberating through the stone walls. The sound grew louder, almost deafening, until I could feel it in my teeth, in my very bones. Halfway up the staircase, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They weren't just in the air anymore, they were inside my head, pressing against my thoughts, filling the empty spaces with their demands. "Let us in, Elliot." My name. Always my name. How did they know me? The air grew colder as I climbed, my breath forming thick clouds in the dim light. The narrow windows along the tower walls offered brief glimpses of the square below. The creatures were gathering around the base of the tower, their glowing eyes fixed on me. "Let us in," they chanted in unison, their voices rising into a bone-chilling crescendo. At the top of the stairs, the bell loomed, a massive, rusted monstrosity suspended by chains that creaked with each swing. The green light was here too, spilling out from the cracks in the floor, pulsing in time with the bell's toll. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The whispers were deafening now, the voices overlapping, distorting into something incomprehensible. And then, the trapdoor beneath the bell creaked open. A figure emerged, its form shrouded in frost and shadow. Unlike the others, this one was larger, more defined, its face obscured by a veil of snow and ice. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it had all the time in the world. "Elliot," it said, its voice a low, resonant echo. "You cannot run." I stepped back, my heart pounding, as the figure raised an arm and pointed toward me. The green light intensified, flooding the room, blinding me. I swung the iron poker wildly, but it passed through the figure as though it were made of mist. The creature's laugh was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "You belong to us now," it said, stepping closer. Desperate, I turned to the bell. If the tolling was their call, maybe I could silence it. I grabbed one of the chains and pulled with all my strength. The bell swayed violently, the sound reverberating through the tower as it swung off kilter. The green light flickered, the whispers faltering for the first time. The figure paused, its form wavering. "Stop," it hissed, but I didn't. With a final, desperate pull, the chain snapped, and the bell plummeted. The deafening crash shook the entire tower, the sound obliterating the whispers, and plunging the room into silence. When I opened my eyes, the green light was gone. The creatures below had vanished, leaving nothing but frost-covered footprints in the snow. But as I stumbled down the stairs, my breath visible in the still frigid air, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The silence felt heavy, expectant, as though the village itself were holding its breath. And then, from somewhere far off in the distance, I heard it, a single, faint whisper. "Elliot." The village was silent now, the air heavy with a cold that seeped into my bones. I staggered into the square, my footsteps crunching against the frost-crusted cobblestones. The bell tower stood behind me, dark and lifeless, its hollow frame an empty sentinel against the night. Yet the feeling that I was being watched lingered, a prickle at the back of my neck that refused to fade. I paused by the Christmas tree. The lights were dim now, flickering faintly like dying stars. The ornaments hung askew, their glossy surfaces reflecting the pale moonlight. I had silenced the bell, broken the rhythm that had summoned the horrors. And yet, the silence felt wrong. A faint whisper brushed against the edge of my thoughts, so quiet I almost missed it. "Elliot." I spun around, searching the shadows. Nothing. The square was empty, but the unease was growing, wrapping around me like icy chains. I forced myself to keep moving, heading toward the edge of the village, desperate to leave this cursed place behind. The road stretched ahead, blanketed in snow. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I trudged forward, each step heavier than the last. But as I passed the first row of houses, I froze. They were standing there. The figures from before, their skeletal forms shrouded in frost, lined the street on either side. They didn't move, didn't whisper, but their empty eye sockets followed me, their gaze unrelenting. My heart thundered in my chest as I gripped the iron poker tighter, though I knew it would do no good. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice echoing into the night. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, the lead figure stepped forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and it raised a hand, pointing past me, toward the village square. I turned instinctively, and that's when I saw it. The Christmas tree was glowing again, but this time, the light wasn't green. It was golden, warm and bright, spilling across the square like liquid sunlight. The figures faded into the glow, their frosty forms dissolving into the air. Drawn by something I couldn't name, I walked back toward the tree. The light seemed to grow stronger with each step, wrapping around me like a comforting embrace. For the first time since the nightmare began, the cold started to lift. As I reached the base of the tree, I saw her. A girl, no older than 10, stood among the roots. Her hair was pale as snow, her eyes wide and filled with an ancient sadness. She wore a tattered dress, the fabric shimmering faintly in the golden light. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She tilted her head, studying me. "You stopped the bell," she said softly. Her voice was quiet but carried an otherworldly weight. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "The bellkeeper summoned them," she continued. "He wanted the village to remember." "Remember what?" She looked up at the tree, her expression distant. "A promise made long ago. One broken by greed and forgetfulness." I followed her gaze, noticing something I hadn't before. At the very top of the tree, above the star, was a small silver bell. It was old, its surface tarnished and cracked, but it gleamed faintly in the golden light. "They were the forgotten ones," the girl said. "The lost souls of Christmases past. They wanted to remind the living of what was taken from them." My throat tightened. "And you? Are you one of them?" She shook her head. "I was spared. But only because of a promise." "What promise?" Her gaze dropped to meet mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. That they would never be forgotten again. That Christmas would be a time of remembrance, not just celebration. The golden light swelled, enveloping the tree and the girl. Her form began to fade, her outline blurring into the glow. "Wait," I called out. "What am I supposed to do?" Her voice echoed, soft and distant, as her figure vanished completely. "Remember us." And then, she was gone. The light dimmed, leaving the square bathed in the soft, natural glow of moonlight. The tree was still there, its ornaments sparkling faintly, but the oppressive weight of the night had lifted. The air felt lighter, the silence peaceful rather than foreboding. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the silver bell. Somehow, I knew it would toll again, not as a summons, but as a reminder. A promise made and finally kept. When I finally turned to leave, the village no longer felt empty. The spirits had gone, but their presence lingered, a quiet reassurance that they would never truly be forgotten. As I walked down the snowy road, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace. Christmas had always been about joy and giving, but now I understood it was also about remembering, honoring the past and the souls that shaped it. And as the wind carried the faintest sound of a bell tolling in the distance, I smiled, knowing the promise would endure.